Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, guest host Shelley Hearn talks with Natalia Linos, a social epidemiologist and executive director of Harvard's FXB Center for Health and Human Rights and a 2020 congressional candidate. They discuss why all public health is political, how to approach politics as a public health professional, and the importance of not only naming climate change problems, but getting involved with them at every level to advance change. Let's listen.
So I want to cover a lot of ground with you, Natalia, and we are going to go from global to local. Are you ready?
I'm ready, Shelley.
I am so excited. I'm going to try to quickly encapsulate your background because it's a unique one, it's an interest one, and I want more people to be like you. So here's the warm-up stuff. You're a social epidemiologist who has worked on climate at the top echelons within the United Nations Development Program. You've been a thought leader with Dr. Mary Bassett, and you've been working on racism and equity. This is the icing for me. You've been directly engaged in the political arena. You've run for U.S. Congress, and now you're serving at your town's legislative branch. This is good stuff. So we're going to dive into this whole nexus of climate, health, and advocacy. And you got to tell me, Natalia, how are you able to even connect these dots between climate, health, and equitable policy strategies? You know, that they're often different worlds. How'd you get them to mix?
Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Shelley. And, for me, I would consider myself a late bloomer when it comes to the climate stage. I really started thinking about social epidemiology. I cared about equity and health and was trained as a social epidemiologist, also worked at the UN looking at poverty issues around some of the biggest inequities, human rights challenges that people were facing. Climate felt a little scary, to be honest. The climate science was a little bit difficult for me to wrap my head around. I was a bit intimidated by the people who were sharing kind of the scientific knowledge. So I would say I didn't get into the climate and health space until well into my 30s, well into, a time when I was a comfortable public health expert. So it was late, but once I entered, I realized that it is so clear. The connections are so obvious, and we need more people who are working on racial justice, who are working on neighborhoods in the built environment to feel comfortable to step in. We don't have to become climate scientists, and it was kind of interesting to see my learning curve. I can now speak the language, even though, to be honest, I don't quite understand all the climate science.
Well, you don't have to. I mean, I think, for a long time, that's actually kept people who are health experts away from climate. I've heard over the years folks going, that's the environment folks got that taken care of. That's not our business. But that's also why there has been such a lag of having people of color, different economic groups. It was seen as this kind of elitist issue. It didn't have a public health voice. So something really has changed. You can't be alone in making these connections.
No, and it has. And I think the air pollution literature and kind of the experience, especially in the global scene, cities like Beijing and Delhi, people not being able to walk outside made the climate and health link so obvious. And the health folks stepped up and realized that they had a lot of power in those settings to say, air pollution is harming kids right now. It's harming our communities, our well-being, our ability to exercise outdoors. And suddenly it became a now issue, not the next generation issue. And I think that temporal shift has been important because I think a lot of people who work in public health care about the now, care about the inequities that are in this generation, not the intergenerational, although, more and more people are able to connect the dots, both the inter and the intragenerational challenges. And I would say that as we open up the field of climate and health to recognize that it's not just climate and health, but climate and health equity that is at stake, that when you're talking about environmental racism and environmental justice, you're really talking about overlapping challenges that similar communities face. You may be facing housing insecurity. You may be facing, income challenges. You're out of a job, and you're facing the fact that there's a power plant next to you and in your community that actually you can't solve for one. You have to be connecting the dots. And so I am kind of excited to be in this space, in this climate and health equity space. And I hope to welcome many, many more people who, like me, may have been intimidated at first to enter this sort of arena.
Well, it's a good message, but there's one more dot we got to connect. So you did those first two of health and climate. It's the advocacy part, which in public health, we often see the politics as a third rail, just in the way we used to see climate as someone else's issue and we stayed away. So you've been grabbing on to all three of these charged kind of high tension areas. And I'm curious, since you started off at the United Nations and you got a chance to work with many different former ambassadors, prime ministers, did that give you some different insights into how to work together, how to negotiate, and maybe that politics wasn't such a bad thing, but a critical thing, in fact?
Yeah, I think my experience at the UN was fundamental to me realizing how important the political space is, whether we're talking about international governance, like a UN system, seeing, heads of state coming together to negotiate agreements like the Paris Agreement, or seeing at the local level, at the country level, what was the role of a minister of finance versus a minister of health, recognizing that, at times ministers of health didn't have a lot of money, therefore not a lot of sway, recognizing that, who is important in each sector, that there are stakeholders, for example, the tobacco industry or the alcohol industry may be going behind and trying to bribe, that, governance and politics is central to health. And so, I worked with Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. She was also former Minister of Health and was her speechwriter for many years. And interestingly, at that time, I felt like I was having two sort of parallel lives. One, which was I was a scholar in public health. I was actually finishing my PhD at Harvard while also writing speeches on issues like, voting rights in Somalia and how to get more women in the Constitution. And, it was completely, I felt like I was having two disjointed lives. But the political piece was also so exciting. I worked for Helen. I worked for the former vice president of Costa Rica, the ambassador of Qatar to the US. And I was able to be sort of that fly in the room in closed door conversations where I saw how negotiations happened, both real negotiations and also where the UN was putting pressure on governments to do better, and hearing politicians share what were the obstacles, the real obstacles, the imagined obstacles. But Shelley, what I also realized was that these are real people. Helen Clark, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was just a regular person who actually needed a coffee and, would sit down and have a conversation. So it became less scary to imagine myself as a politician. It wasn't someone you saw on TV. There were people that I was engaging with, day to day. So I think clearly that experience allowed me to not feel scared to enter the political sphere.
Yeah, well, that is a really important insight that we need to be passing on. Though I gotta imagine, here you are working with these, great luminaries. I mean, how amazing! Not only ambassador and prime ministers, and they have a huge familiarity with health and climate, and then you have the United States, which at that time, while you were working on those issues, was really dragging its feet on climate. We were the outlier. How did that feel to watch the United States be the albatross around advancing climate policy?
It was difficult. And Shelley, I'll share this about my identity. I was born in the US to international parents, but I grew up in Greece. And I spent there my first 17 years, then came to the US for college, but then straight after went to Beirut and worked in Lebanon in the UN. I traveled around the world. I really thought myself more of a global person, working at the UN, having grown up in Greece. But looking at US policy, what the US was doing, made me realize how important the US was, both in terms of setting norms and standards. And that's when I decided that, I had to focus both my research. So I went from doing global health issues to New York City Health Department work to look at, domestic issues. So racism and health in the US, climate policy. It was kind of a turning inwards and saying the US has all this power, has all this money. Obviously, on the climate front, we are one of the biggest emitters, so clearly has the greatest impact too, but also can set, standards and and hopefully set the norms for other countries. That I started doing more work locally in the US. So it was a turning point for me. And, I don't know, my career might take me back out, but I think for now, I am focusing on the US quite a bit.
Well, I got to say, there's no better indicator that you care about the United States than running for US Congress. That, by its very definition, stepping up, being willing to put yourself in that role to say that you're going to bring your talents into public service in the form of US House of Representatives, that says it all. And I gotta imagine, to go from where you were seen to jumping into the fight, jumping into the fray. That's the house is on fire and you're running in with the buckets of water. What gave you the courage to do it?
So, Shelley, I ran for Congress to represent Massachusetts' 4th Congressional District I entered the race in April 2020. So the world changed. March 2020, in February, we were starting to see signs. By March 1st, it was obvious that we were entering a completely new world where public health skills, because of COVID-19, were going to be needed. Some people thought this was going to be a 2-3 month thing, but I think everybody who worked in public health knew that this was going to be, I think, the optimists, 2 to 3 years. People like me who are interested in social epi and realizing that a 2-3 year challenge can really derail and change the trajectory, especially on health equity, realize that this was going to be a challenge for our world for a very long time. So March 2020 hit, I started writing pieces, doing a lot of the communications and advocacy work that I was good at. I was speaking in the New York Times, writing in the Washington Post, trying to use my communication skills to raise an alarm that COVID was going to have an unequal impact on communities, and the US fared a real big challenge because of the structural issues that we had. And that if we didn't do something quickly and at the scale that was needed, something could go wrong. But in my sort of belly, I always knew that it was too late to be doing that, or it would be too long of a sort of trail to be in an academic center. I was at Harvard leading a center to do research, to call from the outside that really the change had to happen from the inside and it would happen at the political level. And so there was an open seat, in my district. There were already 8 people running. And so I threw my hat in, and it was an amazing race. And I don't think I would have had the courage to do it, or even the motivation, that urgency, if we weren't in the midst of a global pandemic where I thought that an epidemiologist who had global health and global experience had something unique to offer to a body at the national level in the US that simply does not have that skill set. Because who is in our Congress? Definitely not epidemiologists. I think there are 0.
Yeah, we could use a few more. We have a few medical doctors. There's there was a microbiologist, but she passed away recently. We haven't had public health, and it's absolutely great. But look, running for office is not pretty. It's a retail job. You got to go to the parades, the house parties. You normally do the glad handing. You're knocking door to door. What on earth did you do during a pandemic? I mean, how'd you get people? Here you are not known in the political circuit. You don't have a machine behind you, which is critical, and not just in Massachusetts, but elsewhere. How'd you get people to trust you with their vote?
So I didn't win. So clearly I didn't get the most votes, but
well, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And I did do a lot better than people expected. To be honest, when I jumped in, everybody was like, okay, there was no chance. And I did much, much better than people expected. And I think there were a couple issues at play for that. One was that I was able to get so many volunteers. People felt touched by COVID. And I have so many stories. There's not enough time to share, but there were people who had lost a parent, a wife, a child, not just from COVID, but also through other tragedies, but they had been unable to grieve, unable to be with them. And they felt that joining a campaign of someone who was really campaigning on a science message and an equity message would give purpose to their lives. So there was amazing power and love. Can I say that? There was a lot of love in my campaign, which is atypical, I imagine, for most campaigns. And there were people connecting. I had a 17-year-old from Texas who was coming to BU as a student. So, he had a connection to sort of Massachusetts, but they were home, shut down, and wanted to do something. And so, I had a fantastic team, mostly women, I should say, in the leadership team who postponed their jobs by 6 months in order to, join the campaign. And then there were people like Mary Bassett, who had been, the New York City health commissioner, who really believed in me running. And, we used all types of tools that we had, even though we didn't have money. She wrote a letter that went out to the district for people above the age of 75. We were reaching everybody else via Facebook and social media. We didn't think we could reach the 75 and above. And Shelley, I received letters back, people who had been so moved. And she had basically said, we need this expertise. She wasn't lying. She was just saying, we need this expertise in Congress, and people saying, we trust you. And that's what is important to me to raise on this show. People trust doctors, they trust nurses, they trust public health folks to be spokespeople on climate, but also on other issues. And that trust we gain as a profession because we care deeply about people, especially in public health. That's what we care about. And so it sometimes feels like a waste that there aren't more people in public service running for office. It actually came pretty naturally to me, and there was a lot of support. So, I won't lie, it is painful. A lot of the fundraising, if you don't have that sort of support that other communities have, and that's a challenge. And maybe, Shelley, that is where our field needs to go. We need to have that organizing that's happening so that when candidates want to step out, they're not on their own.
It's a really good point. There's so much, we're at a nascent stage. And, ironically, if you go back 175 years, this is how public health got birthed. The phrase, actually, public health, was from engaging in the public policy, and it was very political, and it was a very powerful force for equity, for investing in community health. And we got to figure out how to get back to our way. And look, I'm trained as a public health scientist, and I don't normally talk about love and public health. And I'm kind of loving that, there's a slogan to be had here, Natalia. We have to figure this out. And, when you run the first time, you don't win the first time. You got to have name recognition, and you do have to have people who are going to invest in you. And you got the people, you got the hearts. And then we have to think about how to build more and more of that. And if anything, the position you ran for was Tip O'Neill's old seat. Joe Kennedy had it previously, but before you ran for it. And there's a legacy family that had committed to that. This was public service, was a public good. And Tip O'Neill is a legendary Speaker of the House. But he's known, one of his many things, he's always, kind of be pounding on the desk and pointing out that all politics are local. And I think, if anything, what you've said is that all public health is political. And for us, we got to bring the love back into politics and public health and connecting to the people. And maybe that's how we're going to get back to some of our success in being the force for good, for improving health, and much more successful in getting our way. But right now we're getting a lot of pushback. And you haven't always been feeling the love. You've been doing some great work, but I don't know if you maybe can close with the story that you just recently have put out with the Boston Globe on the challenge of the research and studies you did that connected some of the dots, that masking policy is not just on some of the metrics of illness, but it also is an equity issue. Do you want to touch on that one?
Sure. So, I think, Shelley, it's really important that you highlighted that the birth of public health had this political, this advocacy lens to it. And slowly what I see is we're training people to be experts in methods and really focusing on as if it's sort of a technical skill, that can be neutral or apolitical. And there are people like Nancy Krieger and others who are forcing us to say that every question we ask, how we decide to study public health, is political. Because assuming that or trying to push for a neutral science pretty much privileges the status quo. And when the status quo is so flawed, and we can see that it's flawed because we have health inequities across racial lines, we have health inequities across disability and ability, that there are real fundamental issues, then we as public health are doing a disservice by not opening our eyes up to these political forces. So yeah, quickly to your point, there was a debate. We published a piece in the New England Journal of Medicine, excellent methodological piece, difference in difference, showing using a sort of natural experiment of masking lags because different school districts remove masks at a different point of time to show that masks work. But we didn't stop there. We had in the discussion a lot of analysis around how structural racism, how racial capitalism has created these forces that some kids are at risk of COVID and some others. We were trying to do a 300-word social epi 101 for the New England Journal of Medicine readership, where many doctors that may have never gotten trained from Nancy Krieger. And there was pushback. There was a New York Post article that said something along the lines of woke academics believe that masks will solve racism. It was that simple, was like the headline. And clearly that's not what we were saying. But there was this pushback that, public health should stay apolitical because, your results should speak for themselves. But if you're not going to share with people what your results mean, basically that they mean that there is a structural issue or a political issue, then I wonder, where is the hope? Then we're just describing a problem. The hope is that we can change things. And the change isn't going to happen if we don't change our political structures, the ways that we organize our societies. And so I actually think that I'm an optimist. And, again, with the love moment, I think people want to do this work, not simply to describe the horrible challenges that our world is facing. Climate change is an existential threat. We can't stop there. What do we do about it? And we have to outline what the solutions are, build the community sort of advocacy, the forces, connect with the movements that are doing the work on the ground, as well as the politicians at the UN and at the national level, connect the dots. And then we can hope for some future. I'm a mom of 3 kids. I care deeply that we are leaving behind a world that is worse than, what we've experienced. And so there is an urgency, but the optimist in me believes that there is something we can do about it. But that requires us to be political, to name what we see as the problem, and to get involved at every level, not just to describe it. And that's what I hope many, many folks will join us in doing.
Well, thank you for rolling up your sleeves, doing the virtual door-to-door knocking, bringing heart back into that we have to take action. We can't just pontificate. We can't just sit in our ivory towers. We got to get out and be part of taking action to put those solutions in place. So we do need a Emily's List or a League of Conservation Voter equivalent for public health. And I'm already signed up. I'll be knocking door to door next time you're ready to run. So hopefully we get not only more people, more energy, more opportunities, but this is the way that public health needs to go. And thanks for being a poster child.
Thank you, Shelley, for having me today.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu, for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.